Okay. My journey on this started December the 9th, 1996, when my mother called me, not actually my secretary called me and said, your mother needs you, your dad didn't wake up this morning. So I go over to my parents' house, and of course the sight of seeing your father's shell in his bed is enough to grab your attention. But also what grabbed my attention was that it was a congress, it was a library of books surrounding him around this bed. So there he was in this bed, and there was all these books, magazines, journal entries, handwritten notes, just photographs. I picked up I read a citation. He had won a oak leaf cluster, which would have meant his second Bronze Star for rescuing a man in the Hurtgen Forest. And so it was a journey in World War II, and I saw all this mound of paper, and I went, he's trying to tell us something. So I went back there on every Sunday for probably 6 months and read through this mountain of archive of World War II archival information. And what I learned was this, that the Germans attacked on December the 16th, 1944, at the Ardennes Forest, which is forever known as the Battle of the Bulge. It's called the Bulge because they carved a salient in our front lines. Our 500,000 men were spread out over at least 50 miles where they attacked at a few locations. What I learned from reading through these notes was that my father was stationed in Hofen, Germany, the untold story of Hofen, right on the German-Belgian border. And I continued to read through, and I started finding some very unsettling notes. Things that said, my brightest star, I helped save the day. This was not Lieutenant Starter, this was me. He had written those in history books where the name of Lieutenant Starter was mentioned. So I continued to look through it, and evidently what my father was claiming was that someone else had taken credit for what he had done during the Battle of the Bulge. But at this point, I'm still pretty cloudy about what all is going on. And so I continue to go over there on Sundays, and I continue to read. And then I hit gold. There was a correspondence between my dad and a guy named Thor Ronigan. And Thor was in the 395th, 195th or 395th, I'm not sure. It'll tell us in the slideshow in a minute. Infantry, and he was serving in the he was serving in the infantry while my dad was directing artillery fire. But what became very clear was that Thor and my dad were having correspondence with each other, and I could start to see that something was going on here. And my dad's handwritten notes would say, again, he was very haunted by all this. He kept saying, I helped save the day, someone else took credit. So Thor and he had this correspondence, and I was able to determine from this correspondence that Thor and my dad were going to meet in Hofen, Germany in 1990. And Thor had asked my father, he said, I understand that Lieutenant Starter, which is not his real name, cracked up during the Battle of the Bulge. I understand that you replaced him. I would like to interview you for my book. His book was called Butler's Battling Bastards. If you would allow me to interview you for this book, I would like to give you credit for what you did. Now, I will handle this very diplomatically, and I will not discredit another American soldier. So now I'm going, holy moly, did they meet? So I was able to determine that they did meet, and what I was also able to determine from these notes was that the meeting really riled my dad up. He learned that Lieutenant Starter had been replaced by Lieutenant Looney. He learned that Lieutenant Starter was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for evidently filing a false report. My dad, I think, was a depressed man because someone else had taken credit for what he had done, the most important thing he had done to liberate the free world. Now, it gets worse. I was able to determine that Thor had released his book, but my dad was getting mixed up, evidenced by the idea probably that he died in his sleep unexpectedly. He was getting very mixed up, and he didn't know the book was out. But I saw the press release and all these mounds of papers. And in the press release, it had Thor's number on it. So I called Thor. And Thor said, yes, your dad was haunted by this. I can't sugarcoat it, but it is what it is, and I'm sorry he didn't see the book. Well, I got the copy of the book, and the book says Lieutenant Looney replaces Lieutenant Starter on the Germans' initial attack and stays there and fights till the bulge is over. The artillery fire saved the day. It repelled the Germans' attack. The battle at Hofen was the only part of the bulge where the Americans did not surrender a house. So the artillery fire was the hero. Now, I'm going, okay, it would have been enough. That would have been enough if he could have seen that, but he didn't. Now, my mother calls me and said, we've got another book in from Donald Zengrab, Z. And it was called The History of the 196th Field Artillery Battalion. Now, I didn't care about the history of the 196th. I went over and got that book and turned immediately to the part about the Battle of the Bulge. And of course, Lieutenant Starter saved the day. Lieutenant Starter's artillery fire repelled the German attack. It forced the blowtorch commander, Piper, to go around to the south. It hastened the end of the bulge. It hastened the end of the war. Well, by this time, I've had it. So all I do is I pack up all these handwritten notes from my father, made copies of them, shipped them to Z. And I said his name was George Washington Looney. He was born on George Washington's birthday, which is a fact. D knew my dad. Very soft-spoken man. I said, you tell me if these notes are a lie. He called me back. It seemed like the next day. And he said, and Z said, I know your dad was the guy that was there. I know it wasn't Lieutenant Starter. Now, I was elated to hear this, but also, easy come, easy go. Why would he be on my side so quickly? Rocket will know this. Z was a radio operator in Korea. And a radio operator is the field artillery observer's right-hand man. So my father's notes were very technical at times, range and deflection and things like this that I didn't understand. But Z had already made up his mind that the wrong man had been given credit for the Battle of the Bulge. And a very prophetic words, and y'all be sure and ask me about this at the end. Z said, if it's the last thing I ever do before I die, I will see that the right man gets credit for this. All right, so let's take a few minutes and go through the PowerPoint. Okay, he was a school teacher in Monette, Arkansas, before he went in the Army. Obviously, these high school kids knew the war was coming. I think that's an incredible picture. So that's at Monette, Arkansas. Okay, the picture on the left is my dad and his sister, who was one of the most beautiful women in Arkansas, literally. And she actually served worked at a POW camp for the German soldiers in Louisiana. Now, his letters to Carmen, his sister, would be all about the women and all the various countries that he fought. His letters to his parents were all about the farming conditions. So Fletcher was my uncle, and Fletcher was in the infantry. And in my dad's war letters, he would always say, don't worry about Fletcher. Fletcher's going to be okay. But when the war was over, the first thing he wrote was, I'm so glad Fletcher made it because he was in the infantry. And where I came from, not many people survived in the infantry. And the attrition rate in the infantry was over 100%. We had high school kids finishing up that war. Oh, here we go. Now, these are the guy on the picture on the left is the 4 American officers, 3 American officers that served with my dad. They all 4 made it back alive. Now, my father was a farm boy, grew up in a house without electricity, and that's his garden up there. But he didn't get to eat one bite of it. They shipped him over to fight before he got into that garden. Okay, the war begins for GWL, George Washington Looney. There he is landing at Utah Beach on July the 8th. The Germans were no longer on the beach, but that picture on the right is taken at Carentan, which is not far from the Normandy coast. We had not pushed the Germans back very far because the hedge roads were so, if any of y'all studied the history, the hedge roads were rough, and we were not making good progress. And as you can see, his notes, he said he saw his first dead body by nightfall. So once he joined the party, he was in combat pretty quick. The destruction of war, I don't know what else to say. Okay, now we're getting to some of the testimonies. Frank Williams was his Jeep driver and a good one. And he was a crazy by God because I talked to him on the phone. He was a swashbuckling, daredevil kind of guy. And his testimony was very important because the Jeep driver is very close to the field, to the officer Looney. Now, Norm B. Cohen was a Yankee in a Southern battalion. I went up and met him in New York. He testified that he delivered a battery to Operating Precinct 6, which is where GWL was fighting during the Bulge. For you military guys, you'll know that the artillery observer had the second highest mortality rate to the infantry because everyone knows where the artillery observer is. He's at the highest point of the battle scene. But Cohen's testimony was very important. Okay, my dad was, like I said, Dee knew my dad, and he was a pretty soft-spoken man, but he liked to have his picture made. And you guys, so there he is on that tank. But this picture on the right is hysterical. That's my dad with a guy named Flynn, and Flynn found that dog in France and took that dog all the way with him through the war back to Louisiana with him. And they called him high explosive because he'd go flying in the air every time the bombs went off. and there he is flying in the air. Okay, here we're getting into the nuts of this thing. On July 24th, we sent out 1,200 bombers to just blow St. Lo off the map. The bombers were told to follow the smoke line. The smoke line started blowing inward on our men, and the attack was called off. But General McNair, who at the time was the leading military officer in France, he wandered out to watch this attack, and even though the bombing raid was called off, we still had some friendly incidents. Now, McNair's aide came up to my father and said, "Would you get him out of there? He's going to get killed. He's wandering too far out." And my dad said, "Hell no, it's your responsibility." Well, the next day, the attack was back on July 25th. And again, the bombers were told to follow the smoke line. And this time, it was a true disaster. It's the biggest disaster in the history of American warfare. We lost 111 men to friendly fire. And General Hodges, McNair went back out there and got killed and got blown up. So when I was speaking at a nursing home, or old folks home, we're old folks, a man came up to me after I spoke, and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, "I was one of the bombers that day, and I've never known how many men we killed of our own men until today." It was a true disaster at St. Lo, but it was called the breakout. We started making progress after St. Lo. Okay, this tells you a little something. The Germans were fleeing across France. My dad called for artillery fire on this battalion, blew them up. They got down there to the site of the battle site. The Germans had already taken their wounded and left. The French were eating the dead, already carving the meat off the dead horses. My dad found the camera in the front seat of the Jeep, and he finished out the roll. I expect that's the German officer there on the right. And this is what the war was about. The spoils, the women, the art, the booze. Germans took everything that wasn't tied down. Okay, GWL was part of history for sure. He marched in with the French on the liberation of Paris Day. You can see the celebration. He said it was the most incredible celebration you can imagine. Now, they go straight to the Arc de Triomphe, and he's standing there, and a French officer yells, I'm going to get this backwards, "Don't worry, stand up." About this time, a sniper's bullet grazed my dad's ear, hit an armored vehicle, came out and grazed his other ear. And the French officer was meaning to yell, "Get down, be afraid." It was a German sniper. So I guess he was meant to live through that war if he survived that. Okay, whoops, got to go back. Okay, this is what happened to the French women that sympathized with the German soldiers. Their heads were shaved and swastikas were carved into their forehead. All these pictures, by the way, were taken by the soldiers. None of this is AP or UPI pictures. So these pictures have never been seen before other than in this book. Okay, now when they're marching through Paris in this giant celebration, some people ran up, since my dad was in a Jeep, and an officer, and gave him 10 quarts of champagne. I told you how crazy later that Frank was a wild by God. And when my dad got ready to give these quarts of champagne to some officers for an officers' party, all 10 quarts were empty. And evidently Frank drank them, because that's Frank, the Jeep driver. Okay, my expectations is this was not when they liberated Paris. This is when he probably came back through town on leave. But Country Boy from from Charleston, Arkansas, I imagine that was a pretty good show. And we found many pictures like this of French women writing letters to him. He claimed that he didn't sleep with any of them, as he told my little brother that. Now, what does your dad tell his youngest son? I don't know. Whoops. Okay, this is Cologne, Germany, and I just love this picture. My dad evidently liked to have his picture made, like I said, but it reminds me of an old Tom Petty song. I'm on top of the world tonight, and I'm not coming down. But Aachen was the first German city taken by the Allies. Okay, I would be kind of surprised if it doesn't get kind of cold here this winter if this thing doesn't end. He wrote that letter on October the 25th, 1944. Temperatures reached 20 below. I don't know how in the world you fight when it was that cold, but they did. Okay, now we're really getting into the heart of this thing. Those are the Herman sisters, not the Sage Home sisters. My dad was taken out of combat, and this is probably as important a slide as I'm going to show you. My dad was taken out of combat after the Bulge and put in their home. And the lady in the middle, when I went back in '97 and researched this book, I stayed in their home. And she said, you know, your dad stayed with us after the Bulge was over, and he was broken, and his face was covered with ice and snow and mud, and he was bent, and he didn't want to go back into combat. But then she said, you know, there was a guy that they put in our home before your dad came by the name of Lieutenant Starter, and he was anxious to get back into combat. Now, how could Lieutenant Starter have been at the Bulge if he was at the Herman's home? He couldn't have been. Now, the picture on the right is the Hitler Youth. Immediately after this picture was taken, one of those German kids, I'm not sure which one, spit on an American soldier. The American soldier put out his gun and blew the kid's head off. And my dad's note said he was very disappointed in this this American officer. Okay, you got the Germans here. They knew their engineering. You know, so that's my dad standing on top of one of those planes. So, you know, they had more money and time and resources, no telling what they could have done. Okay, it's toward the end of the war. They see smoke billowing in the air. My dad's battalion, the 196, rushes to the site of the smoke. They find a POW camp that's been set on fire. All the bodies, they had been set fire with the bodies, as you can see his note. They had killed everyone and left. There was still smoke in the camp when they got there. The Germans had just left. German prisoners of war, good Germans, as GWL says, but the Germans had it, they wanted to get captured. The Germans that were back at this POW camp in Louisiana could go into town at night and go to the movies. So they had privileges that other Americans didn't have at that point. Just refugees, just think about it. Just think about it. No food, no clothes, no nothing. Okay, towards the end of the war, he just grabbed that Jeep, printed some numbers on it, and drove it around until it ran out of gas. Now, he's part of history. Again, he's part of history. He just happens to be standing there, and he takes this picture, and that's the Russians going in to discuss the terms of Germany's inevitable surrender. The war is over. He's in a town called Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. He is told to tell every citizen to bring their guns in, which they do. One guy brings in a gun still in the box. My dad put his address on that box and sent it home, and it was there when he got home at the end of the war. It was a triple-barrel shotgun. So there. Okay, now this is really the heart of it. This is the view from OP6 where my dad was fighting. That's what he could see, and that's the gas house in 1944. And there he is in 1990, walked over there, and as you can see, if you go back to the 44 picture, they shot 5 Germans on patrol in front of that house. Now, there he is at OP6. And Thor took this picture with him. This is how I know he and Thor got together. Thor took this picture with him in 1990 when they went back for the reunion. And that's me when I went back in 1997. Now, let's see if I can make this thing work. Well, anyway, those trees saved his life. because a sniper shot at him, and the limb exploded right in front of that window. So I'm sure. Okay, now we're getting to the end here. That's Everett Allen down on the bottom left-hand corner. That's his radio operator. And again, you military guys know the radio operator is the field artillery observer's right-hand man. So Everett's testimony was incredibly important, and he testified that Lieutenant Looney and Everett Allen were in OP6 almost the entire time of the bulge. That's Thor up on the upper right, who started all this with Butler's Blue Bastards. These are both incredible Americans, Thor, Everett Allen both. Okay, now we are, this is a very emotional slide for me. That's the Herman sisters and their brother. And when I went back in 1997, they threw a party for me, a dinner. No, not much English was being spoken. I was having a hard time understanding what was going on. But earlier in the evening, they mentioned that my dad was the only American soldier that did not forget their parents. And he sent them a box of candy after the war. And they said, our mother kept all her letters and her jewelry in that box. Well, I went, wow, what happened to that box? Well, that night, someone's trying to hand me a box, and I don't understand what they're saying, but it hits me, that's my dad's box. So they gave it to me that night, and of course we have it at home, and I hope my kids will preserve it. Okay, this kind of tells you what happened. There's Zengrab, your Korean artillery observer. And he lived up to what he said he would do. He fought every day of the rest of his life to get the records changed. And on August 14th, 2002, my father was awarded his second Oak Leaf Cluster with Valor posthumously. So, and Z got sick right after this picture was taken and died. So it is one of the last things that Z ever did. Okay, there you go. Anybody know how many people we lost in World War II?
50 million.
50 million, that's exactly right. So I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to sell the books for 20 bucks a pop, but all the money goes to the Exchange Club. I'm donating the books. If anybody wants a book, we'll sell them for 20, and that's it. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope this was a